Hello and welcome back. This is the week 12 lecture. So now that we are finished with essay 3, we move on to our fourth and final unit of the semester, which is argumentative writing. So we end with this because it's really designed to get you guys ready for what you'll be doing in English 102. So as you might already know, there's a pretty big argumentative writing focus in most 102 classes here at GBC. That's the way we're supposed to do it. And you'll be doing a lot more research in 102. So that class is largely centered around a major argumentative research paper that does have a big research component. So by ending with argumentative writing in 101, the hope is you guys will be ready for what's to come in 102. So today we're just going to go over some of the basic concepts, the most important terms, some things that we just need to understand before we can start doing argumentative writing of our own. So just a quick update on the schedule. So we are entering week 12. We're getting near the end of this semester. Like I said, this is our final unit. So we only have a couple more discussion posts. We have one this week, and then we'll have our final reading assignment and our final discussion post next week in week 13. So we are getting near the end. If you're missing a few discussion posts, you might want to try to get some of those in. I can give you partial credit for late work, as I've already indicated to some of you. So just try to get caught up on those because we are nearing the end. And once we're finished with posts, all we have left to focus on will be Essay 4. So let's talk about some basics when it comes to argumentative writing. And of course, you'll be looking at some examples with our final 2 reading assignments. But let me just give you a very general definition for argument. What is an argument? I think most of us know. We use this word a lot, but let's get on the same page and let's all use the same definition as we proceed with argumentative writing. So for us, an argument is a deliberate appeal to an audience's reason and emotion. And this is an appeal that's created or done in order to create compromise, win agreement, or perhaps to compel an action. So let me read through that again because there's a lot of important stuff in there that we're going to come back to. So an argument is a deliberate appeal to an audience's sense of reason and an audience's emotions in order to create compromise, win agreement, or compel some kind of an action. So think about what that means. We are tapping into a reader's rational state. We are tapping into a reader's sense of reason, their sense of logic, but we're also tapping into their emotions in order to accomplish some kind of a goal. And we really listed 3 different potential goals there. And these are the things we are trying to do with our arguments. We're trying to create a compromise in some cases. We'll talk about that. There's actually an argumentative model that we're going to be learning about really next week. I don't think we get to it until next week, but it will be a way to sort of arrive at some kind of middle ground with your opponent. So that's one option, to sort of reach a compromise between 2 positions, meet in the middle. That's one way to go. You can also win agreement. So that basically means that you convince your audience to agree with your position, with your viewpoint, with your argument. That's what most people want to do. That's not always the goal, but that is probably the most common goal. When it comes to argumentative writing, that can certainly be your goal. And then finally, to compel an action of some kind. So that's important too, and that can often go along with one of the first 2 goals. These are not mutually exclusive. So in the process of winning agreement, you might also compel your audience to take an action. If your argument is that they need to take some kind of an action, that some kind of action needs to occur, then, their form of agreement might be to then go out and take the action. But think about that final option, because it will remind you that arguments are not just abstract things that we can talk about or write about. They have a lot of real world impact, right? They really can compel actions. They can get people to do things, or in some cases, they might get people to not do things, but they can lead to actual real world results. And you might want to think about that as you start to choose your own argumentative topics for Essay 4. You might want to choose an issue or a topic that really matters a lot to you, something that you find relevant, very important for us today, and then you can make an argument that could potentially have some kind of real world impact. So let's talk about some of the basic components of an argument. And we'll start with perhaps the most important unit of any argument, one of the most important building blocks, really an essential building block that you must have if you are going to build an argument. And that is the claim. We're going to be talking a lot about claims over the next 4 weeks. And it's really important as you start to build your own arguments, you have to generate original claims. Okay, so what is a claim? Well, here's our definition, and I want everybody to work with this definition. For us, a claim is a debatable or controversial statement that the writer wants to establish as true, or at least likely or possible. Okay, so again, let's unpack that definition a little bit. A claim is a debatable or controversial statement. Okay, so debatable is really the key word there. Can we have a debate about it? Can there be an argument about it? Can there be multiple positions? Can people take the opposing view to the viewpoint that you are taking? Can there be a debate? If the answer is yes, then it's probably a claim and it will probably work as part of a larger argument. If the answer is no, nobody would really debate it, nobody would disagree, or nobody would take an opposing view, then that probably means that it's not a claim. And we'll come back to that thought in a moment, but let's finish with the definition. So this is a debatable or controversial statement that some people will potentially disagree with or want to argue about, okay? And the writer wants to prove it as true, or at least likely to be true, or possibly or potentially true. One thing you have to remember as you're starting to write and generate your own arguments, you're not always necessarily going to convince all audience members. You're not going to convince all readers necessarily to agree with you, but your argument can still be successful if your readers acknowledge it as at least likely or possible. They can see that there's logic and evidence at work in your argument, so they can regard your argument as possibly true. It could be valid. They might not agree with it for some personal reason or some very specific thing that they don't go along with, but they can still regard it as a good argument, as a well-formed, logical, supported argument. So even if they don't agree with every aspect of it, the argument can still work. Okay, so obviously the goal is to get people to agree, but even if they don't fully agree, they can regard your argument as possibly true, could be, it's likely to be, potentially could be, and that's fine as well. So we use claims to do a lot of things. We can use claims to make an attack on somebody else's position. We can use them to defend our own position. We can use them to suggest a solution to some problem that we've identified, or to recommend some kind of a change, or we can challenge some pre-existing standard or value, or belief. But again, we can use them in kind of an offensive way or a defensive way. If we think about it sort of in terms of like games or sports, right? We can use claims to attack, but then we can also use them to defend, depending on what type of argument we're going to make. But what's really important with claims, we have to make sure that they are debatable, that they are controversial, because if they're not, they are likely to be statements of fact. So as you're kind of going through your notes, and I think I've put this in the module in this week's overview, just make sure you understand the difference between a claim and a statement of fact, because this is one of the more important things that you need to sort of get down and understand as we're starting with argumentative writing. So claims are debatable. Claims can spark arguments, whereas statements of fact are just true. And most reasonable people would agree that they are true. You're always going to get some people who might take a strange position, but most reasonable people will agree on statements of fact. So let me give you an example. A statement of fact would be that I am recording this lecture from home over the weekend. Okay, so that is a statement of fact. That is a true statement. Now, some people might disagree with me, or they might try to disprove that statement. They might think that I'm actually somewhere else at a different time. But it's easily provable, right? It's a demonstrable fact, right? I can probably produce some kind of a timestamp from my camera, from my computer, with the video. I can prove where I was and when it was recorded. And most people, based on looking at this video and just based on what they know about the class and how I record these, most people would just accept that statement as true. Okay, and again, if anybody wants to disagree or fight with me about it, I could probably prove the statement very quickly and the argument would never really get off the ground. So that's the whole point. Statements of fact don't really need to be argued. They don't necessarily always need to be proven because most people just sort of agree. We don't always agree on the facts, right? But there are certain general statements that most reasonable people will agree with. So one of the biggest problems students have when they're trying to arrive at an original argument is they'll often land on a statement of fact and try to present it as a thesis or as an important claim, when really it's just a true statement. So, somebody wants to write about climate change, and they'll say that it's a big controversy in America, or it's a problem, right? Those tend to be true statements. That's not really an argument. You're identifying something important. You're identifying an issue or a problem that you want to address, but simply pointing out that it is a problem or pointing out that people have different viewpoints on it, that's just true. And it's okay to say it. We don't mind statements of fact. We're going to have many of them, hopefully, in our papers. But they usually serve kind of a secondary role. They're setting up your claims, right? Especially in your intro paragraph. You're going to sort of introduce, eventually, once you've chosen a topic, we're still several weeks out, but you're going to introduce the issue that you're writing about, the major topic that you've chosen, and you'll make a few statements of fact. You'll establish some things that are already known, have already been discovered, or you'll just sort of give us a little bit of the, you'll take the temperature. You'll tell us sort of what people are saying, what are the current debates. So you'll make several statements of fact. You'll establish some important facts, but then you start making claims. Then you establish your thesis. You develop your claims in your body paragraphs. So we can use facts as kind of a foundation to build our arguments upon. But at some point, we have to move from establishing some basic facts to then making some claims, some original claims that are debatable, and they come from us. Okay, so going back to my statement of fact, if I'm just telling you a true statement about how I record these lectures, that's fine, but I need to follow it up with a claim. So a claim that I could make is that recording in this way, from home, during my free time, works better, is more effective from a teaching standpoint than recording lectures in my classroom like I used to do a couple of years ago. Now, I have no idea if that's actually true, but it's debatable. Okay, now I'm staking out a position. I'm saying one thing is better than another. Okay, one method works better than another. This is kind of an evaluative argument, not dissimilar to what many of us did with Essay 3. One thing is more effective. One thing works better, and I'm going to show you why. Okay, and not everybody's going to agree with me. That's how I know it's a claim. Some people are going to say, no way, it's much better to record in the classroom. I have more resources. I might have a little more technology at my disposal. There could be other reasons, but there's going to be different positions. There's going to be different sides. Not everyone will agree with me that this method of recording is the best method or the most effective. But I could present evidence. I could present maybe some statistics to support my side. I could talk to people. Again, if I was really going to do this, I might want to talk to students. I could talk to colleagues. I could compile some kind of statistical evidence. And then my opponents could do similar things, right? So we could have a debate. I might be right. My opponents might be right. Depends who makes the better argument. But we can have a debate. That's how I know it's a claim and not just a statement of fact. So be sure to distinguish between those two, because that's very important, of course, with Essay 4. All right, so let's go through a few of the other key terms that I've listed in the overview for this week. Support. Once we have claims, we need support. So claims will generally be fairly broad statements. You can get more and more specific with them the more you learn about your topics and the more sort of involved you get. But often claims by themselves are not necessarily going to do very much. They might be compelling, they might sound really good, but you always need support in order for those claims to work. So support consists of reasons and evidence. The reasons and evidence that you're going to use to support your claims. So this is obviously very important. Right? If we have a lot of unfounded claims, if we have a lot of claims that don't seem to have any support, our argument will appear very weak. It doesn't seem like we've done our homework. We haven't done the work to find the support. So you'll notice I said two different things there, reasons and evidence. Sometimes these two overlap, and sometimes they are a little bit more distinct. So we can think about reasons in a lot of different ways. Sometimes you can supply some of your own reasons. In other cases, the reasons will largely come from your research, from information that you have gathered, things that you have learned, and in some cases, the reasons will be the evidence. They'll be one and the same. In other cases, it'll be a little bit more of a step-by-step process. You have a claim, then maybe you provide some reasons underneath that claim, and then you bring in some concrete evidence, often in the form of things you found in your research. So again, going back to my hypothetical debate about recording methods. So if I'm going to argue that this method is superior, I could have many different reasons. Some of those reasons could just be provided by me, or they could be provided by things I've observed, whether it be in student evaluations or student performance. So I could just kind of generate some reasons of my own. But then I could also do research, and I could find scholars or, researchers who have numbers, stats, other pieces of evidence that I could then also import into my argument, and some of those could kind of work along with my already existing reasons, but then some of that evidence could also just serve as additional reasons. But no matter how you do it, and no matter what form the evidence takes, and we're about to learn about some of the different kinds of evidence, but you always need support for all of your claims. And you're going to be spending a lot of your body paragraphs developing your reasons and evidence. So once we get moving on essay 4, we'll see that a lot of times in our bodies, we start with claims, right? We introduce important claims early in our body paragraphs, and then we spend much of the remaining parts of those bodies developing our reasons, developing our evidence. Okay, so let's just go through the rest of these terms very quickly. Opposing arguments. We'll talk more about these in the weeks to come, but again, just be aware that once you're working with your own topic and developing your own argument, you always have to identify the opposing argument. Again, this is part of the way that you can confirm that your claims are debatable, and your thesis, which will of course be the biggest claim of all, will work in an argumentative paper. So if you can't identify an opposing argument, if you can't find one, that's perhaps a red flag. If nobody can really disagree with you, if nobody's taking the opposing viewpoint, if there is no opposing viewpoint, then maybe you don't have a really debatable argument. So you always have to find that opposing argument, and then usually you're going to want to do something with it. You're going to want to respond to it, refute it, in some way. We're going to learn a little bit more about rebuttals, how we can kind of respond to what our opponents are saying and maybe try to disprove them in some of our body paragraphs. But some of us are a little bit more compromise-minded. And like I mentioned before, we will learn about a method that can allow us to establish common ground with our opponents. That can be another way that we respond to them. We don't always have to be confrontational and combative in our arguments. We can also seek out compromise solutions at times. So we always have to be aware of our opponents. We have to be engaging with them on some level. But we have a lot of different choices when it comes to that. And we'll learn more about those as we move along. And then just also think about the body of your argument, again, as ultimately consisting primarily of our body paragraphs. And we have a lot of time to work through our claims, our reasons, and our evidence. And I've also included just a little bit about evidence. And we're going to talk about these more in a moment when we get into the appeals. Because when it comes to generating reasons and finding evidence for our claims, we're really going to lean heavily on the appeals, which is kind of an ancient rhetorical concept generated by Aristotle back in ancient Greece. We still use this stuff. And there's two kinds of appeals that we're going to be using. So I want to go ahead and just get into these now, because this will give us a chance to talk more about evidence. So you guys see this, you should see all of this in the overview. We have artistic appeals on one side, and then inartistic on the other. So I want to explain what these mean just in case you have any questions or you need any clarity. These are specific techniques or strategies designed for readers and speakers who are making arguments. So like I said, Aristotle came up with these a long time ago, and the idea is these are just tools that we can use, strategies that we can employ when we are making arguments. We don't necessarily always use all of these, but we need to use some of these, several of these. And the key difference between artistic appeals and inartistic, and I try to point this out in the module, is that artistic appeals are generated by the writer. So Aristotle isn't quite using artistic and inartistic in the modern sense, like as in like, drawing or like doing art. He means like artistic in the sense that you are creating it. You are making it yourself. That's how artistic appeals work. These are things that the writer invents. These are things the writer creates. They did not previously exist in the world. Okay? And then on the other hand, we have inartistic appeals. These appeals already exist. You're not making them, you're not creating them, you are finding them. So this is a lot of the evidence that will come through research. The inartistic appeals are basically what we call a lot of the evidence we find in outside research. So this stuff, a lot of this work has already been done by scholars and critics and experts, and you're just using their information. You're using their articles, their books, their statistics to support your claims. Okay, so let's run through the artistic appeals first, because these are probably a little bit more familiar. Most of us learned about these in high school. You might have learned them under a different name, but most of us are pretty familiar with ethos, pathos, and logos. Again, these are Greek terms. If we want to translate them, we can think of ethos as the ethical appeal. Pathos means pathetic, which for us just means emotional. Pathos means emotional appeals. And then logos is easy, that's just logic. Those are the logical appeals. So what do these really mean? Well, let's start with the ethical appeal. So this is all about your sense of ethics as the writer. This is about your sort of ethical presentation. It's about your credibility as the writer, right? So we kind of know about morals and ethics. They mean slightly different things, but they're similar, right? Just kind of speaks to people's values, their qualities, good qualities. Typically those are things that sort of indicate how you're oriented towards others, right? Do you treat others well? Are you trying to do good? So that's very much what you need to think about with the ethical appeal. This is all about your credibility as the writer. Okay, your credibility, your sort of ethical position that you can present to an audience. So this is very much about how you present yourself in your argument. So you have to really focus on two things here. And I think I mentioned both of these in the module. You have to establish your knowledge and your goodwill towards your audience. And both of these should make sense, right? You have to prove that you know what you're talking about, right? Because otherwise your readers are not likely to trust you. They're not likely to believe you. So you have to establish your knowledge. That largely just comes from your mastery of your topic. You have to show that you've done your homework, you know a lot about this, you've been thinking about it, you've generated original claims, you have evidence. So a lot of this goes back to all the other things that you're doing, all the stuff that we've been talking about. That's a big way to establish your knowledge and your overall credibility, is showing your readers, hey, I know about this. I've done the work, I've done the research, I've generated the claims. So you have to show that you're knowledgeable if you want them to trust you. And then you need to establish goodwill. You need to indicate in some way that you want the best for your readers. You are not trying to hurt them. You're not trying to deceive them. You're not talking down to them. You're not dismissing them in any way. So that has a lot to do with your tone. You don't want to come off as too angry or too sarcastic. A little bit of those qualities can sometimes be effective, but you don't want to alienate your readers. And you don't want to seem too antagonistic, like you are attacking them, talking down to them, insulting them. Obviously, that's not going to make them likely to listen. People usually shut down when they're being spoken to in that way. So if you have kind of a friendly tone, but also you want to sort of sell your readers on the idea that your argument, if they agree with it, if they take the actions that you want them to take, or if they believe the things that you want them to believe, that will somehow benefit them, right? That's also part of the goodwill. So you want to have that sort of friendly tone, but you also want it to seem like your argument will help them. You want to do something for them. You want them to at least have a better understanding of something, or maybe you do want them to take concrete actions that could improve their lives or the lives of others. So that's all ethos, right? Ethos is really all about you as the writer and how you present yourself in the text. So just remember knowledge and goodwill. Pathos is the most powerful of the artistic appeal. So let's move on to that one next. Pathos, again, is emotion. I know the word might not make us think of emotion, but that's what it is. This is the emotional appeal. So we are tapping into the emotions of our readers. So almost any researcher will tell you that most people make decisions based on emotion a lot more often than they do based on logic. So even if we think of ourselves as very rational, very logical people, chances are we do make a lot of our decisions emotionally. Most people do. So this is a powerful appeal to utilize, but you have to be a little bit careful, because while it is valuable and it can do a lot to make people agree with you or to make people sort of side with your position, you don't want to overuse it. You don't want to abuse it, because if you're maybe using pathos in an excessive way, it might seem like you are trying to manipulate the emotions of your readers, and people tend to dislike that. So you kind of have to strike the right balance. And also remember, we're not strictly talking about emotions, although we very much are. We're talking about some other things that often get sort of lumped into emotions. So think about beliefs, think about values that your readers might have, and just think about sort of feelings in general, because that of course encompasses a lot of emotions, like raw emotions, anger, sadness, excitement, happiness, like really basic emotions that we can all identify. But then we also have values and beliefs that are often very tied up in emotion. Right? They might not strictly be emotions, but they are influenced by emotions. So a lot of our values, they might be things that were taught to us, by parents or through school or through our church. But a lot of those values are tied up with how we feel. So it's all feelings. And there's some raw emotion, but there's also things that have been learned, things that have been taught, things that might be sort of based on the Judeo-Christian sort of tradition of the Western world, or maybe they're just sort of values that are sort of based on where you're from, your family background. But all of that stuff is kind of tied up with emotions and feelings. So again, this is a powerful thing to use, and you should definitely use it in your own argument. But you have to be a little bit delicate, and sometimes you might want to be a little bit subtle. Now, some emotional appeals can be explicit, and sometimes those can be effective. So, for example, if you're arguing against the death penalty, for example, you could make an emotional appeal to your audience by referencing religious values or by referencing the sixth commandment as part of the support for your claims. This is wrong. Here's why. It's part of our sort of religious tradition. It's based in part on religious beliefs. If you think a lot of your readers would agree with some of those beliefs, if you have reason to believe that at least, a good portion of your audience shares those beliefs, right? Then that would be a very explicit emotional appeal that could work. But in other cases, writers can use more subtle kinds of emotional appeals. And sometimes they can present them in a way that it is not immediately apparent to readers that it is an emotional appeal. Sometimes you can evoke emotions in your readers just by the way you describe things. So the example I use a lot is two different ways to refer to a particular group of people. Okay, so let's say we have some environmental activists that you are mentioning or talking about in your paper. Think about two different ways to describe this group. On one hand, you could call them a very well-organized team taking concrete action to protect the environment. That's a very flattering sort of, glowing description. People like teams. People like well-organized teams. People like people who take concrete action, right? Decisive, organized, working together, accomplishing goals. If you use language like that, you're actually tapping into emotions because you're making readers think positive things about this group of activists. You're sort of describing them in a way that's likely to prompt positive emotions. And that could be very much what you're going for. But on the other hand, if you described these activists as a bunch of hippies and tree huggers, that might not alienate some, but that's going to prompt a very different emotional response. A lot of your readers might not respond positively to that description. They're not going to feel in the same kind of positive way about these people. So now we might be making a very different point. If I call them a well-organized team, it seems like I want people to be on their side. I want people to support them. If I call them tree-hugging hippies, I might be trying to make a very different argument about them. I might be criticizing them, pointing out the inadequacies of their approach, and I might want my readers to feel a more negative way about them. So those are emotional appeals as well, right? Just the way I'm describing people, the word choice that I take, all right? The language that I'm using can often prompt very specific emotions. So again, you can think about pathos on kind of a broad level, right? Sometimes we want our readers to be mad. Sometimes we want our readers to be sad. Sometimes we want them to be happy. So we can think about emotions in that really sort of elementary, basic way because those are powerful feelings and those definitely work. But we can also be a little more subtle and we can think about just sort of prompting a positive or negative response. Or we can think about how language can tie into emotions. But also don't forget about values, beliefs. Do you want to appeal to certain values and beliefs that you think your readers will have? Since we're all sort of in a shared culture, even though we're all different backgrounds, right? We might not all be religious. We might not all have certain values, but generally, if we all live in the same society, we do share some values. We do share some sort of culturally based values and beliefs that a lot of Americans share, regardless of, politics or a lot of other individual things. So you can usually find a few of those. And even like my example, an appeal to religious beliefs, you might not have all of your readers on board, but a lot of readers might be on board. Or if you go to certain sort of core cultural beliefs that a lot of Americans have about freedom and hard work, a lot of people buy into those. Maybe not everybody, but you can get a lot of support from your readers by appealing to those kinds of beliefs, which again also are connected to our emotions. We feel usually pretty strongly about a lot of those things. Okay, so those are the two artistic appeals that I really want you to think the most about. Logos, we don't spend as much time on. That's logic. That really just means for us common sense and a basic sense of rationality. There is sort of a more mathematical kind of logic, formal logic, that we just don't really have to be concerned with in English 101. So for us, logic is just kind of common sense, right? Do our claims and our evidence seem reasonable? and rational to our readers. And again, this really goes back to our ethos. Do we seem knowledgeable? Do we seem like we've done our homework? Are we presenting things that, if they don't seem definitely true, they at least seem possibly true? But that's partly tone, that's partly your research, that's partly how knowledgeable you seem. You don't want to seem over the top, you don't want to seem extreme, because then some readers are going to say, that just doesn't feel logical to me. Most people have a sort of natural sense of what is logical and what is illogical. So that's what we're working with. It's not formal logic, it's just, does that make sense? Does that seem at least possible, or does it not? So you obviously want to be on the right side of that as the arguer. All right, so that's enough for artistic appeals. Now let's wrap up the lecture by talking about inartistic appeals. So again, these are often going to just be called evidence, largely the evidence that we find through research. So the artistic appeals, like we've just seen, we create those. We write those ourselves. We come up with those. That's going to be our own language, our own ideas. Whereas inartistic appeals already exist. They've already been created, and it's our job to find them and use them effectively. Okay, so let's go through the types I have listed in the overview. Anecdotal evidence. So we talked about examples recently, a few weeks ago, and I may have mentioned an anecdote is what we often call a long, extended example that takes the form of a narrative. So a little mini narrative. We often have characters and things are happening. There's a little bit of a plot. There's some kind of theme. There's some kind of moral to the story usually. And we use these as evidence. Like I said when we were talking about examples are great evidence. So anecdotes or anecdotal evidence are basically just stories from other people. Again, they're often taking the form of narratives, but short. We don't have time to have a really long story in the middle of a paper, but these can be brief little narratives, right? So an extended example, more than just a sentence maybe, and they detail the experiences usually of other people, but they could also come from you. You could provide anecdotes of your own. So again, we use these as extended examples, and they work great as evidence. So you can supply some of these yourself, but you're going to find a lot of anecdotes through your research. You're going to find the stories of others, sometimes told in their words, sometimes told by other people, but you can get your hands on those anecdotes. Okay, so just remember examples. We can always use examples, whether they be multiple examples, multiple short ones, or extended anecdotes. Also, let's think about testimonial evidence. This is an important one. Testimonials, that just means you're using the words of other people, often in the form of direct quotations or paraphrases or maybe summaries. So obviously you're finding a lot of these through your research, right? You are finding the words, the findings of others. So you might be quoting experts, scientists, doctors, professors, people who work in the field, people who know a lot about the topic. You can quote them. But as we're going to talk about in a couple of weeks, we don't always want to quote. Sometimes we can just paraphrase or summarize somebody's words. We can put their words into our own words. But of course, we still have to cite them because the information is coming from them. It's not coming from us. Again, it's an inartistic appeal. It already existed in the world, and we just went out and found it. But that's always going to be an effective type of evidence, testimonial evidence. But remember, they don't always come from experts. In some cases, they can come from regular people who have some kind of firsthand experience or direct knowledge of the topic. So I always use the example of like toothpaste commercials. If you've ever seen one, you'll often have a dentist or probably an actor playing a dentist who comes on there and provides a little bit of expert testimonial. But then you'll often get like regular people who say, oh, I've been using Colgate whitening for 6 months and my teeth have never looked better, right? And then you hear from some other regular people who have firsthand experience with the product. Hey, it worked for me. It worked for me. I used to be a smoker. It worked for me. I drink 5 cups of coffee a day. It worked for me. And then we go to the dentist and he says it works. And okay, now we've gotten testimonials from regular people and an expert. So we can do both. All right, and then finally, let's think about numerical evidence and graphical evidence. Really good sources of evidence support for your claims. So numerical evidence, we're going to find a lot of this through research, right? Statistics, measurements, any kind of data, really, like raw data. Sometimes it might be even things like dates or times. But we can often find these in the articles that we're reading for research. So these are often going to be numbers. Sometimes statistics can take other forms, but we usually refer to stats as numerical evidence. So obviously, if you're working with a topic that's kind of related to science or technology, or maybe a medical topic, a lot of those really lend themselves well to numerical evidence. A lot of statistics, a lot of numbers you can present as evidence. But sometimes it can be a little bit of a challenge to explain all of those numbers, right? Especially if you're pulling them from scientific publications, or stuff about like computer science, stuff that regular people often don't know a whole lot about. You can't just throw those numbers in to your paper and expect everybody to immediately understand. You'll often have to break them down, provide a little bit of explanation to go along with the stats. But again, those work well. And then finally, graphical evidence. We don't always have access to these, but if you can, it's nice to provide some images, maybe some charts, maybe some graphs, maybe a diagram. All of that can work as support for your claims. But again, you have to explain these sometimes. They might not always make sense out of context if you just drop them in directly from one of your sources. And again, not all of our topics will really have any graphical evidence available, but if you can provide at least one, that can often be a nice supplement to go along with all of your other evidence, all of your other support, which again means reasons and the kind of evidence that we're talking about now. So a lot of times you can maybe create some reasons through your artistic appeals, mainly through pathos, those emotional appeals. And then you can find a lot of your hard evidence through your research. You can find these inartistic appeals largely through research. But you can also talk to people, right? You can get some testimonials, maybe from friends, coworkers, anybody who might have some relevant knowledge about your topic. So these are the ways we can start building our arguments with claims and support. So we'll end here for this week. We'll come back next week. Next week is a short week due to Thanksgiving, but I do have some new concepts for us, even though I know a lot of us will be sort of checked out the second half of the week. But we really need to get all these core concepts done over the next 2 weeks so we can do conferences in week 14, and then we are working on Essay 4 in week 15, which is our final week of class. So email me if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.